Hello everyone. Welcome to this session on issues to do with embodiment within the overall event Responding to the Sacred, Gender and Liturgy in Conversation. And welcome to our two conversation partners. Lisa and Marion come from different contexts. Marion is a priest in the Scottish Episcopal Church who's had a ministry with people living with HIV. And she's also the honorary LGBTI+ chaplain at the University of Edinburgh. She's currently Vice Provost at St Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh. So as a priest, she's often worked with people whose embodiment, sexuality or gender has led to discrimination or exclusion. And I might, at this point, draw attention to the link on our conference programme to this week's A Space to Bless, a radical queer space for contemplation, connection and meditation, produced by Jo Clifford of Queen Jesus Productions and hosted by St Mary's Cathedral. Lisa Isherwood is now Emerita Professor of Theology at the University of Winchester and Research Supervisor at Lampeter, University of Wales, Trinity St David's. She's taught feminist and queer theology for many years and published widely on these topics. As head of the University of Winchester's Institute of Theological Partnerships, she promoted theological debate in the wider community around politics and ethics and economics, things like mind and body and the lived environment. Her current theological theme is to understand divine incarnation, embodiment, in ways that are not limited by the human gendered body, but reach out for a much more ambitious notion of cosmic embodiment with powerful implications for how we should be living and worshipping in this vulnerable material world. I know these two have much to say about identifying barriers and fostering genuine inclusiveness within the church. And I think perhaps the problem is more likely to be getting them to stop. So if I can start by asking Lisa, I know you have thoughts about the underlying theology of incarnation. Would you perhaps like to start by giving us a bit of an overview and perhaps indicating a little bit how this might, in your view, challenge some of the things we currently do and say and promote as a worshipping community? And then perhaps Marion will respond and I will leave you to have a conversation. Thank you.
Alison, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. This is such an important topic in my view, and I've had wonderful conversations with Marion already, so I wish to thank her for that at the start. I think for me, any talk of embodiment in Christianity has got to be rooted in incarnation. After all, that's one of the central doctrines, ideas of Christianity, that whatever the divine might be, the divine became incarnate. Again, from my point of view, and not just mine, many others, I think this has been made almost impotent by centuries of being overlaid with dualistic metaphysics. And the result of this has been that this powerful image of the divine as human has kind of fossilized in the person of Jesus as a perfect man, more after the sense of Platonic ideals than this radical notion of the divine in human flesh. So what I really am very concerned about and get very distressed about is how this fossilization in this person of Jesus has acted more as exclusion than inclusion, because not only have we got the gender of this man Jesus, but all sorts of layers of colour and many layers, I'll just say that at this stage because the debate will open it up, have been placed on top of this fossilized image, and in my opinion has done a great disservice to the original Christian message. Now you can imagine that I'm a feminist theologian, and many decades ago, feminist theologians were saying, hang on a minute, can a male saviour, and they used that language, save women? And the answer was, no, I don't think so. Really, if we have to be the image of this man. So many theologians had a look at this, got involved in it, but the one that I'm particularly indebted to is Carter Haywood, who did her PhD work on the Gospel of Mark. And in there, she found that there were two very important concepts. One was, and excuse my Welsh pronunciation, one was dunamis and the other was exousia. And for her, dunamis, however you wish to pronounce it, was the raw energy of incarnation. It was the raw energy that she felt Mark's gospel talked about us all having, we were all born with. And she says that she feels that in that gospel, in as far as we can work out that Jesus said anything, but certainly the writer of that gospel said it was this power, this energy, that was the most important thing, the shared heritage of incarnation. And that exousia was something that perhaps not the early churches, but the early enough churches decided that authority over was much better, because you could control people with authority over much more than you could control people if you said, do you know what this message is? This message is that you are human divine. This is who you are. You carry the divine within your flesh. And this allows the great expansion of what the human might be. And I love John Casanas, who said many decades ago, Jesus kicked a hole in what we thought was the reality of being human and wanted us to follow on and make that rupture bigger. Not just say we'll close it, we'll say we can't do it, but make it bigger. So a feminist reading of Mark, according to Haywood, which I would agree with, means that our flesh is divine flesh, not just the flesh of Jesus. So we are all absolutely incarnate, in potential, in the way that Jesus was. I like to call it spiraling incarnation, because it's not a linear event any more than I think it was a linear event in his life. We see gospel stories and stories in the Apocrypha where, it wasn't just here was this baby born perfect and he kept getting even more perfect. It was a spiraling incarnation. So this is the view that I prefer. So what am I saying? Well, I'm saying something that I think a lot of people will find hard to accept, actually, which is that we are, as divine in flesh, we are that passionate dance of the human divine that is co-creative, co-redemptive, and not really truly that we are the people who are charged with, left with the duty of being co-redemptive and co-creative in our reality, in our lives, because this is, if you like, the very powerful message that Jesus was trying to demonstrate. So this, of course, is not something about narrow boundaries and denials, and please don't deny the flesh because the flesh is so wicked. It's actually an embrace of the wonderfulness, the full incarnation. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute that people don't do terrible things. Of course they do, and I'm sure that will come out in the conversation. But my understanding of our birth reality is that we are radical people in the true sense that we are human divine. I do believe that this is a biblically based, you can argue for it. You can argue if you need to, which it's quite interesting that many theologians these days don't feel they have to argue from the Bible for it, but I think you can biblically argue for it. You can argue for it from, if you like, church history, where some church historians like Richard Rambus have shown that this total incarnation doesn't allow normal, if you like. You can't have a normal human divine person. You can, in one person, Jesus, one incarnation, can be normal, white, male, straight. But normal, there is no such thing as normal human incarnation. It is diverse, it's very creative, and it's very unusual. And somebody like Rambas shows that this happened throughout Christian history. There are many, many people who are showing that in their devotion to Jesus, they cross their genders. One minute they see themselves as male, the next as female, and that not only that, the figure of Christ that they are worshipping does exactly the same, that there's no absolute rigid gender for a start. There's no rigid anything. All the boundaries are crossed. Now, does this actually tell us that those who we have thought of as mystics in our tradition understand a bit more about the nature of human divine incarnation than we have? Well, I'm not sure that Graham Ward was a mystic, but he also, or is a mystic, but he also tells us that the Gospels, go back to the Gospels, and they are full of shape-shifting, if we can use that term, that shape and location change all the time, and that what happens when that happens is salvation history gets bigger, doesn't get smaller. So he says it starts off with something quite peculiar, which is you have a male baby from a female body, and if parthenogenesis were possible, you would have a female baby. So it starts off already as not what you would expect. The physicality is changed. And then he looks at all the stories, and I mean, we could go into great depth, but I won't. And he's saying that right from the start, the whole materiality is expanded. You know, Jesus walks on water, the figure of Jesus is transfigured, ascends into heaven, and then after death is supposed to be present in bread and wine. Well, how does this happen if you're saying that materiality itself and the absolute essence of embodiment is so rigid? It couldn't happen unless you're going to make such a change between what it means to be born human with that raw divine energy and then some other God who cannot be incarnate. I think it's Laura Schneider who says, you can't have that if you're going to have incarnation. You can't have that kind of metaphysic if you're going to talk about incarnation. So for Ward, the thing that becomes so interesting is the sexed body of Jesus becomes a problem. The gender of Jesus becomes a problem. But actually, the corporeality of Jesus becomes a problem. Unless you say there are no limits to our own. We can change, we can move. If we take incarnation seriously, then we are all these things potentially. We have room to move with all of these possibilities. And I'm very interested by the idea that Christians have always said that they're pilgrim and resurrection people. So is that what it means? Does it actually mean the possibility of shifting and shaping and moving and not being so stuck in one sense of being that perhaps I haven't made clear up to this point, but this one sense of being is so connected with the person of Jesus that, you know, you're supposed to image him so closely that it becomes almost impossible. For me, and indeed for Marcel Altafried, the incarnation and divinity talked about in John's Gospel is one that planted a tent, and a tent is not a fixed dwelling. A tent moves about, a tent changes shape. This then, leave that bit by saying, this is my understanding of divine, human divine, that we as those possessors, in fact, more than possessors, we are this dunamis that Hayward says is we are that. And so we are shapeshifters and should be. not linked into one sort of personality. And Alison mentioned at the beginning my work in eco-theology. And in fact, with that and with the cosmic theology, all that happened was convince me even more that if Christianity is to talk to contemporary debates and to learn from contemporary debate, as it always has. I mean, theology has always needed some sort of partner that interprets it to the world. And cosmology, I think, the new cosmology interprets it very, very well, because it points out to us that nothing is static. Nothing comes from nothing as well, which is also very interesting, that this one creator who creates this one perfect sun is a myth. Everything that was to be was already there, was in creation and is becoming from creation. And therefore, incarnation, when we go right back to the beginning, to the creation of anything, is the rule. It's not an exception. Everything was there, and everything grew from what was there. So I think if we're to talk about Christian liturgies, which I completely admit I am no expert at whatsoever, I think they must demonstrate in word and action that incarnation is about inborn energies of the universe that we share. Everything that we share, the empowerment, the human, the divine, and the heritage of dunamis. So everything that is a liturgical action, I think, needs to show this raw energy that belongs to us all. And Catherine Keller is saying this is about entanglement, which I think is a very much easier way of saying some of the things that Christian theologians try to say in a very complicated way. She's just saying there is such an entanglement of the human and the divine that you can't actually do anything, and I would say particularly liturgical actions, without showing that entanglement. And that something she says, which I love, and I think it applies really to anything liturgical, is that we must feel the pulsations of our bodies in our planet and the pulsations of the planet in its universe. Our earthly interactions are rendered simultaneously intimate and virtually infinite. So for me, this is it. Liturgical action has to encompass that sentence of Keller's, that it has to be intimate but virtually infinite, because that's who we are, not just when we die, but actually in our dunamis, in our raw energy. Thank you.
I really love, Lisa, that sense of movement that was right through everything you were talking about. And this talk about the divine human dance and the energy and the synergy. I suppose what I'm wondering, given that our focus is liturgy and liturgies as used within church buildings, actually what might express something of that, particularly to people for whom church buildings are either uncomfortable spaces or spaces that have at times caused pain, or simply people who have kind of very fixed assumptions about the fixed nature of church?
Well, I think obviously the easy answer, except it's not easy, is get rid of the church buildings. Of course, you can't do that. But my understanding, and I do have a book here, which expresses it, and I can't see it. But anyway, many of the early liturgies were not within buildings. They were actually outside for the very reason that they were surrounded by the fecundity of creation.
Yeah.
And that on the altar, whatever that was, which might just be a table or it may even be the floor, they couldn't put anything that showed it might be death, so no wine because it was red, and nothing dead. You could only bring fruit and vegetables and things that were alive and beautiful flowers and so on, because what you were trying to celebrate was the actual connection and the beauty of our place in all of that. That we had a place in it, that this was sort of it. And I know you can't go knocking down church buildings. And anyway, I think a lot of this happened in climates that were so much better than ours.
Well, indeed.
You know, I think kind of up a Welsh mountain in the middle of winter would not be conducive. But, you know, that's the point, I think. How do we get back to connecting and in some really radical sense saying, if, as Keller does, that everything was there in the beginning. That I think she says at one point, the command that has been interpreted in Genesis as a command wasn't a command, it was a whisper of desire. It was a whisper for embodiment. It was saying, I want embodied things to connect with, to hold, to touch, to be involved with. And Haywood says similar sorts of things, that, you know, God created because God wanted to love. And in order to love fully, you need something to love. She doesn't quite say it like that. And so, as I say, I'm no expert on liturgy, but for me, that is terribly important, that connection, that dance, that reality, that we are all from the same mess. We're all from the same chaos, the same stuff of the universe. A very profound theological phrase, that stuff, but it's all the same stuff. And every single one of us, everything that blossoms, that flies, that crawls, it's the same stuff. And that, how do we show that? And can we show it? And I mean, it is a big question. Can we show it in bricks and mortar, however beautiful they are, that contain, and there's, you know, liturgical dance, and that brings in movement, but again, it's contained. It's contained. What would you say? I mean, what would you say to that? How would you feel about that?
I guess one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking was, we're recording this on Maundy Thursday, and I was actually thinking about the Stations of the Cross, and when they were first introduced, they weren't indoors. They were an outdoor event. Yeah. And much more of a journey, much more of a sense of pilgrimage, and I think of arriving at specific places to stop and to reflect. Yeah. And certainly some of the imagery I've seen from very early stations allowed the stations to kind of nestle themselves into the space where they found themselves.
Yes, yes.
As opposed to what often feels like a plonking down, a placing,
yes. Yes.
because it suits us.
Yes.
So
yes.
I think for me, there's something about how do we move back to a way of actually making liturgy within creation.
Yes.
And I think that's, for me, that's not about not having buildings, but actually it's about seeing our buildings as being within the space that they inhabit.
Yes, yeah.
So I guess there's something about buildings that have grounds surrounding them, and also buildings that don't, buildings that are in the midst of very urban areas.
Yes, yes.
And actually how do we engage with that? So one of the things we're just about to do in our cathedral is we're going to put some swift boxes in one of our spires. there's a big project to encourage swift nesting within the cities. And church spires are apparently they need somewhere high, and it provides the right kind of environment for them. So I think there's something about those kinds of examples of what it means to actually be embodied beings living and co-creating and therefore supporting.
Yes. And co-redemptive as well. I mean, you're saying in space. I mean, the sisters at Penmine Mawr, they have a cosmic walk that takes in all their grounds, the whole, at Winchester, we were only given a certain amount of ground, so we had to create it within that. But again, it was there were not stations to stop at, as it were, but there were points where, and at this point, by the way, there were horseshoe crabs, and they were millions of years before you. What do you make of that? And at this point, and it was that sort of reflection. But I think the one at Penmine Mawr is very much more about, and this is the point you are in creation, and in fact, you're very young, and perhaps as a very young set of people, you need to listen a lot more and settle yourself in, as you're saying, Marion, settle yourself in much more to what's been there for billions of years before you, and literally understand your place. I think I was sharing with you that lovely story that a rabbi was saying at one of our conferences, that when God had finished the creation, or one way to understand Genesis is that God then turned to the creatures and said, well, what about these humans? What will we do? And the creatures said, if they behave, they can stay. And as soon as they don't, they're going, and we'll get rid of them for you. So they're going. And I think, there's something there that, to me, is a very charming kind of midrash. Or is that the correct word on that? Story? It turns it round. It doesn't say that we're the top of anything.
And I guess then it starts to take us into a different way of addressing that question of what it means to be made in the image of God. And takes us right away from that sense that being made in the image of God looks a particular way.
Yes. And it looks like we are just emerging from the stuff like everything else. And we're a very late emerger from the stuff. So we've got a lot to learn. There are things that we're here living perfectly well and ecologically before we were even thought of. We're late. We're very, very late.
And so if we go with that premise that we're very late emergers, I'm wondering whether the binaries that thus far we have squeezed ourselves into living with actually are part of an evolutionary development almost.
I think it's almost, this sounds a very cheap sort of answer, and I don't mean it, but it's almost because we're adolescent that we think we know all the answers, and we think it's like this, and it's quite fixed. It's we're not experimental enough with sort of who we are and who we might be. But I also think that the churches have had quite a big influence. I was going to say negative, but I'll keep away from that. A very big influence on how we may be and who we may be, and as I said at the beginning, it's because of this very fixed image of Jesus, which I agree with Hayward, I agree with Ward, I agree with so many others that there isn't a fixed picture. There is a man Jesus, but there's a concept Christ. And the man Jesus, to many degrees, showed this concept Christ, but freed that through this idea of dunamis. You are my friends, greater things than I have done with you, etc. The writers were saying, you're free. And I said, the lovely John Casanas, you know, I've kicked a hole, make it bigger. You're free to move into what you think is reality. You're free to make it bigger. You don't have to make it narrower. You don't have to, well, I mean, I'm sure you've come across it many times, I have. You don't have to make people so afraid to be in their own skin that they forget how to live, that they don't know how to live. They're rigid in their own bodies because they're afraid, because they've been told that there's so much that they could do wrong if they dared to do anything. And I think that's so sad. Well, in fact, I think it's blasphemous. I don't think it's sad. I think, you know, if the flesh is divine, then to put those railings around it is just appalling, isn't it? It's just appalling.
But is it not? It's not just about doing wrong. Actually, for a lot of people, it's hearing that their very being is wrong.
Oh yes, yeah. And so what can we do?
You know, as we develop and I guess think about adolescence, as our self emerges, I think for many people, the messages they've had from the church and indeed from other faith communities have been that the being they understand themselves to be is in some way wrong because it doesn't conform. And I guess it's back to that kind of notion of binary, isn't it?
Yeah. It's down to the binary, and it's down to that you don't have the divine within you unless you are this image. And we know, and especially at the moment with that desperate report that came out, you know, that for years it was unless you're white, you're demonic. We know this, we can see it. It's the color of your skin. Well, I mean, okay, thank goodness well, I hope most churches have moved away from that, although I heard a horrendous story about it the other day. But we haven't moved enough in other areas, have we? We haven't said, whoever you are, that the important thing is for us to nurture you in loving yourself. Whoever we are, parents, church, community, that's the thing. We need to nurture two things in you: trust and love of the self. And if we can do that, I think that's a Christian message, you know, because there's something there about cast out fear and love one another. So if we can do that, then we are helping to set in place a healthy human psyche, which is surely what we need. And so that as people are faced with the questions about themselves, they're not filled with fear, and they're filled with the idea that people will hold me in this. They'll hold me in whatever it is I'm trying to come to terms with.
Yeah, it's interesting you saying that, because in our confessional liturgy, we say God is love.
Yeah.
And there is no room for fear in love. And we say that week after week after week.
Yeah.
And I wonder to what extent we actually, or people are hearing us say, God is love, provided love is this very particular shape and form.
Yeah.
And I think what you're pushing us to think about is that actually love is far more expansive than we could begin to grasp.
Yeah, I think so. And I noticed the Liberation Cross on your wall. And, you know, back in Medellin in 68, was it 68? You know, the theologians who'd been trained in the West went back to Asia and Latin America, and, you know, God is love. And the priests and the bishops who were there were saying, this is outrageous to tell these people that God is love, because look at how they're living. What are you going to do? How are you going to change how they're living and how they're approached and how they're understood? And only then you may dare say that God is love. But up to that point, let's not have this this rubbish. You know, I only had a conversation yesterday with somebody who said, well, you know, there's a lot of this training of clergy that tries to turn people into middle-class clergy, even if that's what they are. And then they go to council estates. And this one example was, well, how can I love you more? And the people from the council estate were saying, what do you even mean? What does that question even mean in our situation? And why do I want you to love me more? I want you to do more. I want you to change things. Be part of a change. And it's and
I think you could address that question to people who have been ostracized by churches.
Absolutely.
So, you know, how do you love me more isn't a question for people who have heard the message that actually you're not acceptable.
Yeah. And so many people are not acceptable. I remember, must be 15 years ago now, a friend who came from the Caribbean many years before that and had been an Anglican, and they'd been a white priest, but most of the congregation had been black. And she came over and she went to an Anglican church on a Sunday morning, and the white clergy person said to her, so nice to see you, but we won't expect to see you next week.
Oh my gosh.
It's like, okay, and why is that? Oh, wait, you wouldn't really fit in. No, you wouldn't really fit in. So her answer was to go off and set up a black church, and great, good. But you know, we've done it so many times, and even if we don't do it with words, we do it with attitude. And,
or I think with the imagery or lack of imagery that people can resonate with.
Yes.
So we have lots of paintings of white people, and almost all of them portray heterosexual couples if they portray any sort of coupledom.
Yes.
You know, and the kinds of posters we have, you know, I don't know, come to our book group. You'll have nice kind of shiny, gleaming, heteronormative pictures.
Yes.
You're unlikely to, in those images, have somebody who is, I don't know, clearly a trans woman.
You won't.
You just won't.
No. I think in one of our conversations, I said to you how powerful I thought it would be if the actual host could be a rainbow host, if somehow we could make a host as a rainbow, because that would not only be LGBT, you know, I, Q, etc. inclusive, but it would be race inclusive, because rainbow was used in South Africa. It would be inclusive of a lot of people, and I think it would say a lot of things, because a student years ago wrote a thesis called "We Are What We Eat," and it was a critique of the Eucharist, that, you know, we are what we eat. So if we've got to stick with a host, if we can't have fruit and veg and outside, and let's have something that's inclusive. Let's have something that actually says, it's a rainbow community in the true sense of the word. It includes everybody. Because you're so right, imagery is so important, and all this blood everywhere. Well, perhaps not in your cathedral, haven't been there yet, but
No.
All this blood imagery and this this gruesome stuff. You get the feeling, don't you, that that's what Christianity is about.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about suffering. It's not about abundance of life. It's not about expanding and glory of incarnation. It's about suffering.
Yeah.
And the number of times, I'm sure you're the same, the number of times I've heard women who are beaten to a pulp at home saying, well, I'm suffering with Jesus. I'm suffering with Jesus. And I just,
Yeah, absolutely.
It breaks my heart.
Yeah. But also those crucifixes with the drippy blood actually are very male imagery. And it's interesting because, of course, menstruating women have been ostracized within churches.
Yes.
So there's good blood and bad blood, isn't there?
Yes. And when those Latin American women put bloodied tampons and sanitary towels on altars and said, this is the blood of life. This is the blood of life. I mean, gosh, it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking. I mean, of course it was. I mean, in a sense, yes, but nobody could see that this is what they were meaning. And we don't want to keep looking at this. The other thing that gets me, the crowns. I'm not the crowns. I think because here's hierarchy. The blood and the crowns and the imagery. Is so difficult.
And what do you think then about the way that language reflects that? So, a lot of women will say that they find the use of words like Lord and King really uncomfortable.
Yes, yeah. I have a colleague whose surname is King, and she said growing up she always thought they were talking about her. So she didn't mind. but I mean, yes, these are not explained, are they, as Christological terms that are by now really outdated. They are. They're not conveying anything that at the time that Constantine was doing his thing, they were saying something. They're not saying anything now. They're redundant terms. But again, I things like friend and lover, and these are a bit, I'm not even sure about those.
No, you see, I'm not sure about those either. But just going back for a sec to think about King and Lord. I think one of the troubles for me with those words and thinking about how we make our language more inclusive is actually that the female versions of those terms have been completely devalued.
Absolutely.
So if we started talking about queen, actually that has such different connotations.
Yes.
And so I guess there's something I think really interesting about not just using a mix of male and female language. In fact, I'm not sure that that's the right thing to do at all, personally.
No.
But I think you're right. I'm also not sure about friend and lover, to be honest.
No.
I think the kind of Jesus is my friend. Well, yes, but.
Yes. Yeah. And I think if we're getting to this incarnation as well, that we are all this thing of human divine is so close. It's so close.
Yeah.
That how can you use that language? Because I'm not a queen. of any kind. Even if I drag up, I'm not going. So how can we use that language about who, if we're going down this incarnational route of saying this is really the crux of it all, how can we use any of that language?
Yeah.
I don't know what we use. I mean, in my writing, I just use divine because it's a cop-out, but it's all I can think to use.
And the trouble in liturgy is there's a limit to how many times you can say divine.
Yeah.
I actually really like the narrative around co-creation, but I don't know how you translate that into liturgical language.
Difficult. But
I think it's really difficult.
But that lovely priest in I think Devon or Cornwall, and before every baptism, he used to take the child outside and hold it up to the fore, and he used to say, co-creator, co-redeemer, welcome, welcome, and then get on with a sort of traditional baptism, which I don't know, if that helps. I don't think it does, but language is so difficult. Language is so restricting, which is why I suppose embodiment, because the body speaks so much louder than the words that come out of people's mouths, don't it?
Absolutely.
It's very difficult. And I don't envy those people tasked with liturgical reform, because I think whatever they do, they're not going to please people.
Yeah. I'm increasingly wondering whether some of the answer is actually how we use our embodied selves.
Yes.
And I think that's as priests at the altar, but I think it's also within the congregation.
Oh, yeah.
So how do we collectively make some physical statements about, I suppose, about what we're doing at the Eucharist?
Yes, I don't know. I mean, one that I went to, everybody was told, bring a stole. If you haven't got a stole, bring a purple or bring a colourful thing and wear the stole. And whatever, I think there are about 8 or 9 clergy of different denominations doing it. Whatever we're doing, you do, so that we're all doing it together, so that it's a collective thing. Do everything that we're all doing it. I think there are about 200 people there, and move a lot. I mean, that big joke about genuflect, the Vatican rag. I think there's something in there about movement. Don't just sit there and listen. And I mean, the dervishes know this. The dervishes move a lot in their prayer. I understand it. There's quite a bit of movement in Jewish, particularly Jewish men. I'm not sure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the way Jewish men daven.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's important.
They're rocking the whole time.
Yeah, yeah. And certainly from my reading of somatic psychology, which is about like that much, if you can get everybody moving together and doing something together, something quite incredible sort of happens. A big change happens, a big change of atmosphere, of understanding sort of happens. So that might be worth an experiment, but as again, I'm no expert. I don't know, because I know singing is great.
Yeah.
But most people, I've noticed, when they're singing in church, they stand very still, and it's all very good. And it's like, come on, put a bit of oomph into it. get going. So I don't know. I think there's something there. There is something there about movement, but I think it's about communal movement, not just about how the priest moves.
It's also about engagement, isn't it? Because actually, if you get everybody to stand on their feet and sing, they're all participating. Yeah. Rather than sitting and observing something happening up front by the experts.
Yes, yes.
And, within the church, we've done that whole professionalization thing.
Yeah, and why not get them to dance while they're standing up and singing? Why not, and you know, get the priest to dance? I mean, we could have a few embarrassing, what's her name, movements, Theresa May movements, but
yes,
just move, do things together, and I would think if that could be outside. I mean, we had a couple of experiences in the Cosmic Walk when we had some conferences and we did things outside. All sorts of people joined in who had nothing whatsoever to do with the conference because they said, "Oh, you're dancing. You don't know what you're saying," because quite a lot of them were foreign students who'd come to language school. "Don't know what you're saying, but you're having a good time."
Yeah,
Come and join you. It was quite interesting.
I guess a good I think Alison's stopping us.
At the point, I was just keeping my eye on the clock here and breaking in a moment. But sorry, Marion, do finish your sentence.
I was just going to say, I think a good example of that for a lot of churches has been when they have outdoor dawn services on Easter Day.
Yeah.
And actually that very visual witness. And people do stop and want to engage. And I think it's the wanting to engage because there's something about the collective experience that we're really witnessing to those services.
The body wants to join in, doesn't it? The body wants to be part of something.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And I think what you become part of with your body is something so much more than you can imagine. You know what I mean? You think, oh, it's just these people doing that, but then it becomes bigger somehow.
Yeah.
Can I, at this point, that was a fabulous conversation, which I very much enjoyed listening to. And I just wonder whether to finish off, having taken us on this wonderful journey, you would be able to give us perhaps a final thought or a final question to kind of for people to go and think about on the basis of what you've been saying. I mean, maybe you don't want to do that, but I leave it as an option. Lisa?
For me, it always has to come down to how do you express, which I was saying earlier, that incarnation, human divine incarnation, comes down to how do you learn not to fear and how do you learn to trust? And when you've got that as your basis, then I think you have something very divine as a basis. So how do churches, through liturgical practice, and it doesn't have to be 200 people gathered, it can be 2 people, 3 people gathered, how through liturgical practice do we convey that? Do we express that? How do we express the joy of it? Sometimes there's pain of it. How do we do it? And how do we do it in a very eco-connected way as well? For me, would be the big question. And I have no answers.
Thank you. Well, I think you've made some suggestions. You've suggested some directions that people can take forward as well. Thank you very much for that. What about you, Marion?
I think for me, there's something about how do we actively express something about inclusion, and particularly in visual ways. I'm really interested in what we say to people through what they see. And it seems to me that that is an area of life within our churches that we haven't thought hard enough about, and that actually is somewhere where we could make a very significant statement and a significant difference to people, because if we could find some way of visually saying something about the nature of the incarnate God.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you both very much indeed for all the effort and time you've put into this. I know it's not always been an easy business getting together, and I am immensely grateful to the both of you, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope that our viewers enjoy it too and come back with some interesting reflections. So thank you so much.